Hey, if you're a fan of Van Halen, I think you're going to like what I have for you here today. I found this article, and it's an interview with Michael Anthony. And that's why it was kind of interesting to me, because I really like Michael Anthony. I remember when I first discovered Van Halen, you know, I love David Lee Roth. I love the personality, the big, you know, energy and all the stuff that he brought. Alex Van Halen, you know, was this great drummer and did all this cool stuff. Eddie Van Halen, I was a young guitar player, so I loved Eddie Van Halen. And then there was that other guy, you know, and I didn't think much of him. And I've told the story before about when I saw them on the 1984 tour and his crazy bass solo. And over the years, more and more, I've just come to really appreciate the guy. I think he's just he's just the nicest, most down-to-earth, just really cool dude. And so anyway, going back now and finding this little article where they were actually interviewing him and listening to him talk is pretty cool. Now, if you're looking at the article on the screen, if you're not just listening to it, if you're looking at it, you'll recognize probably that picture. It's in a newspaper, so it looks a little bit, you know, the contrast is a little bit intense. But this is a picture from the back of the album Women and Children First, and I've just thought I'd bust that out as I was doing this video. This is my copy of Women and Children First. This is the actual one I bought when I was, I don't know what I was, 14 or something when I saw this. And I took this thing home. I just love this album. That first song was just so cool, in the Cradle Will Rock. It had that perfect David Lee Roth energy and the phase shifting stuff on the guitar, and I mean it was so awesome. But anyway, so there's the front, there's the back, and that's the picture. And here, and you've got, of course, David Lee Roth, Alex Van Halen, Eddie Van Halen, and then, like I said a minute ago, oh yeah, that other guy, the bass player, Michael Anthony. And anyway, so he's the focus of this article. But this, anyway, I thought I'd just bust that out since I was talking about it here. And the title of this article is Hard Rock Van Halen Joins Ranks of Visigoths. And I think it was weird to hear them use that word. And I think that, and if anybody out there knows why they're making this point here, I'm sure it just has to do with kind of the idea of bigger than life rebellious barbarism, you know, the commanding presence and taking over and that kind of thing. So anyway, so after 3 albums in 3 years and 4 years of endurance, Hard Rock Van Halen joins ranks of Visigoths. And then this is, they're writing this article because apparently, as you read there in the article, it says Van Halen will perform at 8 p.m. at El Paso Civic Center. Tickets are $8 in advance and $9 the day of the show. Available at Ticketmaster outlets. And by the way, if you saw Van Halen during one of these early tours, especially this one, Women and Children First, this is 1980 when this article's written, and I was starting to really get into music. In 1980, I was starting to exit the Kiss phase. And then I'm starting to, what else is out there? You know, and then I start again, you know, there's the Van Halen and the Led Zeppelin. And then that's when Ozzy was hitting, and I'm like, and you know, getting into all this stuff. And I know that a lot of people that watch this channel can relate to that experience. Anyway, I think you're going to enjoy this. And I haven't read the whole thing, so I've only read a little piece of it. I just know what it's about. And so we will experience this together for the first time, some of this article. Okay. Hard rockers Van Halen alight in El Paso Tuesday with a few tips for local youth on partying, the teenaged word for hedonism. The group's performances indeed reflect the party ideal. As perhaps the most prominent purveyor of American hard rock, Van Halen has become one of the most in-demand rock acts in the country. The group has released 3 albums in 3 years. The total sales approach 10 million. So, of course, they had Van Halen, the original Van Halen 2, and then this. Years of self-determination and a little ingenuity proved vital to Van Halen's success formula. Mikkel Gilmore wrote in the September 4th issue of Rolling Stone, quote, "The group is now one of the undisputed kingpins of hard rock, ranking alongside such venerable Visigoths as Led Zeppelin, Ted Nugent, and Aerosmith." You know, it's funny. I'm a Ted Nugent fan. I used to listen to him all the time, but it's interesting going back in time and recognizing just how popular he was. I mean, he was huge. We kind of lose track with some of these bands just how giant and how famous they were, because they kind of get lost after a generation and we forget really how big they were. Okay. Indeed, Van Halen's numerous virtues not only helped earn the group its vast wealth, but has underlined the very authenticity of its approach to hard rock. Guitarist Eddie Van Halen's talent has been likened to that of Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck, both in terms of complexity and straightforwardness. Singer David Lee Roth lends the band's punch as much eloquence as any hard rock vocalist can muster. He struts his stuff and does it convincingly, as though he's not afraid to carry the crotch rock banner. The group's desire for graspable music is evident in the solid rhythm foundation of bassist Michael Anthony and drummer Alex Van Halen, whose dependability allows guitarist Eddie and singer Roth to work the leads and propel the hooks. "We know what we want," bassist Anthony said in a recent telephone interview. "We do things on stage that we like to see," unquote. Anthony maintains that Van Halen's popularity may stem in part from its constant connection with its audience. Quote, "We don't sip champagne with the headliners," he said. "Once you do that, you start losing touch. You've got to relate." Rolling Stone's Gilmore wrote, quote, "When David Lee Roth declares that the life Van Halen leads is the same as the one the band sings about, what he's saying is that it's a life brimming with easygoing sex and unabashed affluence. Like nearly all their comrades of the metal persuasion, Van Halen ballyhoos the time-honored ideal of ceaseless, remorseless, inebriated partying. In fact, in their capable hands, the party ideal becomes a hard and fast commitment that no matter where Van Halen alights, a boisterous, full-blown Saturnalia is bound to follow." Van Halen's visceral pull spread rapidly in 1978 with the release of its debut album on Warner Brothers Records. Eddie Van Halen's quick-witted guitar phrasings turned songs like the hook-filled Runnin' with the Devil and Kinks' classic You Really Got Me into menacing hard rock juggernauts. The album sold more than 3 million copies, phenomenal for a new entrant to the recording rat race. But the rewards were the result of the 4 years of endurance. Van Halen formed in Pasadena, California. Each member had experienced firsthand the music world in some form. The Van Halens were born and reared for a few years in the Netherlands, where they received some tutelage in classical music. Roth's father was in the music business. Anthony's dad was a jazz musician in Chicago. By the mid-70s, the Van Halens had acquired a taste for hard rock and formed a band named Mammoth. And fans of Van Halen will know that, and you'll also know how Wolfgang Van Halen has now taken that moniker and used it. Roth was performing a blues act. Anthony fronted his own band. Their paths crossed enough times that eventually they came together as Van Halen. And that's an interesting thing, because when you listen to Van Halen and you listen to this stuff here, you hear that really, they have a very unique harmony in the music that harmonizes with David Lee Roth. And it's this really high-pitched voice, and it's Michael Anthony. And so he's actually, in his own right, an amazing vocalist and was a really important part to the Van Halen sound. Roth suggested the name, foreshadowing the group's later control over the merchandising of the Van Halen name. Anthony describes those 4 formative years as a, quote, wedding. He remembers some of the band members to be seeing one another walking to and from class in junior college. He remembers how the group booked its own shows, distributed its own flyers, and even took odd jobs to keep the cause alive. "I dropped out of school," Anthony said, "to focus on the band. It was a slow time," unquote. Times were tough with the band, vacillating between its desire for self-control and the necessity of playing top 40 hits for jobs. But even the difficult moments weren't without humor. Quote, "One time Eddie and Alex bought overalls, got some stencils and some paint, and put street numbers on curbs. Anthony said of the leaner days. We were living on the musician's diet, ketchup and water, unquote. While the period may not have been that severe, the members of Van Halen found the going slow. Quote, we started writing some original stuff, Anthony said, but things would get tough and we'd have to play top 40 for a year. The group eventually began to manage itself, booking its own shows, even producing a series of concerts in the Pasadena Civic Center that drew 500 people in the beginning, before blossoming to crowds of nearly 5,000 by series end. Quote, before we signed with Warner Brothers, we did everything, Anthony said. Everything was decided within the band, so we couldn't blame it on a manager. It's all kept within the group, he said, sweeping managerial decisions and merchandising ideas under the same rug. Van Halen matched the awesome commercial acceptance of his first album with the release of Van Halen 2 in 1979. The group had done well with the FM airplay its first album received, but songs from the new album worked their way into the AM radio charts. By the time the dust had settled, Van Halen had scored a pair of hit singles in Dance the Night Away and a remake of You're No Good. And of course, those are both on Van Halen 2. Van Halen 2 was it really was a great follow-up for that first album. We'll talk about that one sometime soon. I love that album. Anthony considers vital the contact the group established with audiences around the country during the group's first American tour in 1978. It was this contact that helped bring about a more accessible sound to the second album. But the radio success was not deliberate, he said. Quote, we're basically an album-oriented band, Anthony said. So if Warner Brothers wants to pull a single like Dance from the album, we say, okay, because that's their job. But a song like You Really Got Me was one we'd played for years. We played it when we used to play bars, unquote. The group's roots as a bar band extend further to parties, dances, and you name it. That experience allows Van Halen to gear its show immediately to audience satisfaction. And that's just an interesting thing to a question to pose to everybody watching this. They really did have a way of creating some sort of energy that just kind of everybody just gets. And it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on what it was about Van Halen, their music, their approach, whatever the thing was that made them have such broad appeal. What was it about them that gave them that universal appeal that not a lot of bands have? Quote, from the beginning, we have considered ourselves a live act, Anthony said. That's what helps sell our albums. Anybody can put a record on the turntable, but live, you can see the band, unquote. Van Halen's primary existence as a performance act is what establishes the premises on which the group records. Quote, when we record with our producer, Ted Templeman of Doobie Brothers fame, we play live with few overdubs, Anthony said. We do it with the live show in mind. And that's actually a really important thing, because so many bands kind of cornered themselves, paint themselves into a corner, if you will, in the studio, because they put so much stuff and layer so many things. There's just no way they can reproduce the sound live. And they do overdubs. It's not like they don't, but it is pretty stripped down. And when you do see them live, it's pretty close. You know, they keep it fairly simple. So, although I'll tell you, I've told this story before, but I saw them on the 1984 tour. That was the first time I saw them. Of course, that was David Lee Roth. It was the last time David Lee Roth, for a long time. And, you know, Sammy Hagar came in. They were really, I don't know, they were pretty sloppy. And it was, I hate to say it was a little bit underwhelming. It was cool just because it was Van Halen and I was excited to be there. But there was this, I walked out of there like, yeah, I don't think Eddie actually wanted to be there. He looked bored. But it was fun, you know, it was cool, whatever. Okay. Let's see. The group's newest album marks a return to this concert sound. Women and Children First signals a return to the fresh sound that sparked the first album. The new album entered high in the trade charts after its spring release. It cracked the top 10 in less than a month. It's more powerful, Anthony said. Women and Children reflects the group's instinctual songwriting. Its pounding rhythms, observant lyrics, and throbbing guitar work spark the band's clean, hard rock sound. Van Halen is reproducing its live sound with elaborate staging. Quote, "We call it the 55-ton gun," Anthony said of its live presentation. The tonnage incorporates 800,000 watts of light and 40,000 watts of sound. Despite this numerical vastness, Anthony stresses the concert's focus is elsewhere. Stage effects are minimal. Quote, "The emphasis is on the band," he said, "not on flames or explosions. We can't play pyrotechnicians." Van Halen's stop in El Paso is one of many the group will make along its tour, dubbed The Invasion, which began in March. The group already has toured Europe and part of the United States. The tour will take the group through stops in Hawaii, South America, not confirmed, but Roth is shaking hands on it, Anthony said, and Japan. The tour ends in November. Let's see here. "Sure, it's Animal," Roth said of the group's act to writer Gilmore. "I mean, people might like to talk about art, but look where art is. It's in the expletive gutter, starving. Van Halen likes to keep things simple, none of this vague, symbolic expletive. All we're doing is giving our daily lives melodies, beats, and titles. What we sing about is what we live," unquote. Anthony describes Van Halen's appeal more cosmically before touching on the group's cliches. Quote, "A lot of Van Halen's magic is the feeling. Everyone has a little bit of Van Halen in them. We just try to bring it out and have a good time," unquote. So again, I want to ask that question to you because, Michael Anthony tries to answer it a little bit in this article. What is the appeal of Van Halen? What was that? What was that thing that when David Lee Roth got back with the group and they went on that tour, I don't know what it was, like 10 years ago or so, I took my son and we went to that. And it was cool just seeing them back together. And of course, Michael Anthony wasn't in the group, which I didn't like that much, but it was the music. But the point was they were filling a 20,000 seat arena. And this is how many years later? David Lee, I mean, they hadn't really done anything truly substantive, really, really well known in a few decades. I mean, with David Lee Roth, that is. Because all the stuff that was really, really popular, was way, way back. And yet they have that universal appeal that just kind of stuck all that time. So then he makes that comment, everybody has a little bit of Van Halen in them. We're just trying to bring it out and have a good time. So it'd be interesting to hear you answer that. What do you think? What was that appeal? What was the thing that made Van Halen have that X factor that made them stick, that made people flock to these concerts and then even all these years later want to listen to this music? It's a pretty interesting thing to think about. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that video. Please like the video. Please follow the channel if you like this stuff and leave those comments that I mentioned. And with that, have yourself a fantastic day.